Greetings, dear viewer. Today we dive into the fascinating story from the life of the great detective Miss Marple Theatrical Passions. When a mysterious robbery occurs during the theatrical premiere in the small town of St. Mary Mead, only Miss Marple can unravel this complex tangle of intrigues related to the past. Get ready for an exciting journey into the world of mysteries and detective investigations. I wish you a pleasant viewing. Chapter 1. The premiere. St. Mary Mead had never been the center of theatrical life, but when the local amateur theater announced its production of ** The Heist of the Century*, the entire village buzzed with excitement, especially since the director was the village's newest resident, a young and ambitious James Harrington, whose parents had once owned Blackwood Estate. Miss Marple, as usual, took her favorite seat in the front row. From there, she could observe not only the events on stage, but also the reactions of the audience. Among them, she noticed several unfamiliar faces. Mr. Trevor Kent, who had recently purchased the old lakeside mansion, Miss Eleanor White, known for her collection of jewels, and, of course, James Harrington himself, pacing nervously backstage. The play began with the grand robbery of a London bank in 1920. The actors, dressed in old-fashioned suits, portrayed the cunning thieves who had infiltrated the vault. Miss Marple noted to herself that the dialogue was remarkably realistic, as if the playwright had personally witnessed the events. During intermission, Miss Marple approached James Harrington to congratulate him on the excellent production. The young man seemed troubled. "You know, Miss Marple," he said, glancing around, "I'm bothered by a strange coincidence. One of my actors, Robert Davis, bears an uncanny resemblance to a man involved in the actual robbery 30 years ago." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. How fascinating! And who was this man? But James had no time to answer. The second act was beginning. Now, the scene shifted to the mansion of a wealthy collector, where the thieves had broken in at night. Here, Miss Marple noticed another oddity. The set was an astonishingly accurate replica of Miss Eleanor White's home. Most striking was the reproduction of her famous jewel collection, displayed on stage. The curtain fell after the final act, and the audience erupted in applause. But the joy was short-lived. Suddenly, a shriek came from Miss White's box. "My diamonds! They're gone!" The entire hall froze in shock. Miss Marple rose from her seat and carefully scanned the room. She noticed Mr. Kent hurrying out and Robert Davis nervously adjusting his tie. "It seems we're dealing with something more than mere coincidence," Miss Marple said to a stunned James Harrington. "And I'm certain the key to this mystery lies somewhere in this theater's past." While the police examined the crime scene, Miss Marple thoughtfully studied an old photograph of the theater troupe from years ago. Her gaze lingered on one face. The next morning, as Miss Marple walked through the park, she encountered Miss White's gardener. The old man looked uneasy. "Miss Marple," he whispered, glancing around, "I saw something strange last night. Someone was climbing into Miss White's house through the same hatch the robbers used 30 years ago." Miss Marple thanked the gardener and headed to the library, where she began poring over old newspapers. Something about this story unsettled her, as if every event had been too perfectly planned. Chapter 2. Mysterious Coincidences. The next morning, Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair examining old newspaper clippings she had found at the library. One particular article caught her attention, a report about the jewel theft from Miss Eleanor White's house 30 years earlier. The article mentioned the name of a man who had been suspected but never convicted, Richard Harrington. "James Harrington," Miss Marple whispered, recalling their conversation the previous evening. "So your father." At that moment, her niece Louisa peeked into the drawing room. "Aunt Jane, you won't believe it. There's news just in. The police found a note at the crime scene. It's written in the same handwriting as those messages Miss White received before the first robbery 30 years ago. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting. Very interesting indeed. And you know, Louisa, there's something I need to check. She went to Miss White's house, where she found the collector having tea, clearly distressed by recent events. You know, Miss Marple, Miss White began, nervously fingering her pearl brooch, my late husband always said that first incident was more than just a robbery. He believed someone used my collection as cover for something far more serious. Just then, the telephone rang. It was Inspector Grayson from the local police. Miss Marple, he said, we've found something interesting. A ticket for tonight's train to London was discovered at the crime scene. It was purchased in Trevor Kent's name. After the call, Miss Marple asked permission to examine the mansion. She carefully studied every detail until her gaze fell upon the old floor hatch the gardener had mentioned. How curious, she murmured, kneeling down. This hatch has clearly been opened recently. But why would someone choose such a complicated entry point? Returning home, Miss Marple decided to re-examine the photograph of the amateur theatre troupe from 30 years ago. Her eyes fixed on the face of one actor, bearing a striking resemblance to Miss White's present-day gardener. So it all begins on stage, she said aloud, and ends there too. The next day, Miss Marple visited James Harrington in his apartment above the theatre. The young director looked troubled. I know what you're going to ask, he admitted. Yes, my father was connected to that first case, but I swear I knew nothing about it when I chose to direct this play. The script simply seemed perfect for our theatre. Did you know your lead actor, Robert Davis, used to work for the police? Miss Marple asked gently. James paled. What? No. I had no idea. It appears we're dealing with a very cunning plan, Miss Marple said thoughtfully as she moved toward the door. And I'm quite certain the key to solving it lies somewhere in this theatre's archives. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. Miss Marple decided to spend the evening at the theatre, where * the heist of the century * was being performed again. She knew that if any of those involved in the crime were to make a mistake, it would happen here on stage, where emotions ran high under the spotlight. In the foyer, she encountered Mr. Trevor Kent, nervously smoking a cigar. His eyes kept darting between the entrance door and the wall clock. You know, Mr. Kent, Miss Marple began in a gentle voice, I've always found your collector's albums quite fascinating, especially those pages where you describe the history of old castles. Trevor paled. What castles? I don't understand. But Miss Marple was already heading toward the stage. Backstage, the usual pre-performance excitement filled the air. Robert Davis was adjusting his costume, while James Harrington gave last-minute instructions to the actors. Have you noticed? Miss Marple asked a passing makeup artist. There are extra lamps on stage tonight. That seems like a new addition. The play began. This time, Miss Marple paid close attention to the smallest details, how Robert Davis slightly stumbled during an important line, how James Harrington lingered too long backstage before each act. Midway through the second act, something unexpected happened. One of the set pieces suddenly collapsed, nearly hitting the actress playing the lady of the house. Everyone froze in shock. That was deliberate, Miss Marple exclaimed, carefully examining the mechanism controlling the set. Someone intentionally loosened the fastening. Inspector Grayson, who had come to observe the performance, immediately ordered an inspection. During the intermission, he gathered everyone in the dressing room. Miss Marple is right, he announced. We found traces of an oily substance on the mechanism. Only someone familiar with the theatre's technical aspects could have done this. At that moment, Robert Davis turned pale. I have something to tell you, he said, addressing Miss Marple. The truth is, 30 years ago, I worked on this very case as a policeman, and I know the truth. Most intriguing, Miss Marple interrupted. But before you continue, allow me to point out a curious coincidence. Did you know your great-grandfather was Mr. White's personal bodyguard? Robert looked utterly stunned. But how? How did you know? Oh, my dear, Miss Marple smiled. In a small town, everything is connected one way or another. And I'm quite certain the key to this mystery lies in the family history of one of tonight's performers. After the play ended, Miss Marple asked Inspector Grayson to stay for a private conversation. She showed him the photograph of the theater troupe from 30 years ago, which featured a man bearing an uncanny resemblance to Miss White's present-day gardener. "Remarkable, isn't it?" she said. "I wonder why a gardener would need to return to the house where the first robbery took place, using the very same hatch." The next morning, Miss Marple received an anonymous note that read, "If you want the truth, come to the old theater at midnight." Chapter 4. Night at the Old Theater. Miss Marple had never been particularly fond of adventures, but when she received the anonymous note summoning her to the old theater at midnight, her eyes sparkled with curiosity. She knew this wasn't just a challenge, it was a crucial step toward solving the mystery. At the appointed hour, she carefully ascended the theater's creaky steps. The moon shone brightly enough to cast peculiar shadows on the walls. The air smelled of old wood and paint. "Who's there?" Miss Marple called out as she entered the empty auditorium. The only response was a faint rustling behind the curtains. She moved forward slowly, listening intently to every sound. Suddenly, a flashlight beam revealed a figure standing by old stage props. "Robert Davis!" Miss Marple exclaimed. "I rather thought it might be you." "You're mistaken," Robert whispered nervously, glancing around. "I only wanted to find something that might help uncover the truth." "And what exactly were you looking for?" Miss Marple asked gently, noticing him slip some object into his pocket. Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of another man, Mr. Trevor Kent. Our true collector," Miss Marple observed, watching the two men exchange tense glances. "You're both hiding something," she continued, "and I'm quite certain the key to this mystery lies somewhere here among these old stage props." They began methodically examining the premises. Miss Marple noticed a peculiar scratch on one of the wooden panels. When she tried opening it, she discovered a hidden compartment containing an ancient bundle of papers. "Look at this," she said, unfolding the document. "These are the original blueprints of the White Mansion. But why were they hidden here?" Trevor Kent looked troubled. "Those plans, they belonged to my grandfather. He was the architect who worked on the mansion." "Did you know, Mr. Kent," Miss Marple interrupted, "that your grandfather also helped build this very theater?" And curiously, one of these drawings shows an underground passage connecting the theater to the White residence. Robert Davis paled. "But that's impossible. That passage was sealed off years ago." "Was it really?" Miss Marple mused. "Now let me ask you this, Mr. Davis, why would a man who worked on this case 30 years ago need to revisit it now?" At that moment, another rustle sounded, and James Harrington emerged from behind the curtains. "Forgive me," he began, clearly agitated. "I happened to overhear. That is, I heard your conversation. I must tell you that my father always said one peculiar thing before he died." "Most interesting," Miss Marple interjected. "But before you continue, allow me to share another remarkable coincidence. Did you know your father and Mr. Kent's grandfather were close friends in their youth?" Suddenly, an alarm clock rang out, making all three men startle. It was already 4 in the morning. "It seems our night has come to an end," Miss Marple said, moving toward the exit. "But I'm certain the most important answers lie within each of your family histories." The following morning, Miss Marple received a message from Inspector Grayson, found old police station logbook. "Your great-grandfather's name mentioned, Miss Marple." Chapter 5. Family Secrets. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair examining the old police logbook Inspector Grayson had delivered. On one page, she discovered something astonishing. Her own great-grandfather, John Marple, was mentioned in connection with the first robbery at the White Mansion. How curious, she murmured to herself. It seems my great-grandfather wasn't just the theater watchman, as I'd always believed. At that moment, her niece Louisa peeked into the drawing room, holding an old photograph. "Aunt Jane, look what I found in the attic," she exclaimed. "It's a family portrait from around that time. But Mr. Harrington Sr. is in it too." Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. Her gaze lingered on one man standing beside her great-grandfather, a figure bearing a striking resemblance to Miss White's present-day gardener. So it all began with old connections, she mused. I wonder why my great-grandfather would have worked with James Harrington's father. The next morning, she visited the local newspaper archives, where she uncovered another crucial detail. 30 years ago, it was Richard Harrington, James's father, who had purchased the theater after the robbery case was closed. "It appears we're dealing with a most ingenious intergenerational scheme," she told Inspector Grayson during their meeting at the cafe. Just then, Robert Davis approached their table, looking deeply troubled. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you," he began. "I've just uncovered old police records mentioning your great-grandfather as a key witness to the first robbery." "Did you know, Mr. Davis," Miss Marple asked, raising an eyebrow, "that my great-grandfather wasn't merely a witness, but also had access to this theater's most secure areas?" Robert paled. "But that's impossible. Only Inner Circle members knew about the underground passage." "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "And I'm quite certain the solution lies within each of our family histories." Later that day, she visited Miss White's house, where she encountered the gardener. His behavior seemed peculiar. He was clearly afraid of something. "You see, Miss Marple," he began, nervously twisting his cap, "I always knew my grandfather was involved in that business, but he never shared details." "Did you know your grandfather worked with my great-grandfather?" Miss Marple asked gently. "That together they designed the alarm system for the White Mansion." The gardener looked utterly stunned. "Then, the underground passage still exists, and someone's using it now." "It seems we're nearing the truth," Miss Marple said, moving toward the door. "But before we continue, let me share another remarkable coincidence. Did you know your grandfather and James Harrington's father were business partners?" Chapter 6. The Underground Path to Truth. Miss Marple had never been one for nocturnal adventures, but when she discovered the underground passage between the theater and the White residence still existed, her curiosity got the better of her. She knew that if she wanted to uncover the whole truth, she would have to descend into these ancient tunnels. Armed with a flashlight and accompanied by Inspector Grayson, she began her journey through the underground passage. The walls were covered with moss, and the air carried the scent of dampness and ancient stone. "Remarkable, isn't it?" she said, shining her light on strange markings on the wall. "These symbols, they were clearly left here deliberately." Suddenly, they heard rustling ahead. Moving cautiously forward, they discovered a man rummaging through old crates. "Mr. Kent," Miss Marple exclaimed. "What are you doing here?" Trevor Kent looked startled. I was looking for something that might help reveal the truth. The fact is, my grandfather left me a note before he died." "And what did this note say?" Miss Marple asked gently. Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of another figure. Robert Davis stood at the tunnel entrance, clutching a bundle of old documents. "You're all mistaken," he began, glancing around nervously. "I know the truth, and I can tell you everything, but first—" His words were cut off by the sound of falling stone. Part of the ceiling began to crumble, blocking the exit. "It seems we're temporarily stuck here," Miss Marple observed, pulling a shawl from her bag. "But this gives us an excellent opportunity for an honest conversation." She studied all three men carefully. Did you know, Mr. Kent, that your grandfather wasn't just the architect of this passage, but also had the key to a special security mechanism? Trevor paled. But how? How do you know that? Oh, my dear, Miss Marple smiled. In a small village, everything is connected in one way or another. And I'm quite certain the solution lies within each of your family histories. Robert Davis fidgeted with his documents. The truth is, my great-grandfather was indeed a policeman, but he also worked with your great-grandfather, Miss Marple. And together they created the security system for this passage. Miss Marple finished for him. I wonder why your great-grandfather needed to conceal that fact. Suddenly, faint knocking came from the blocked exit. It was James Harrington, who had come to check why the others were delayed. Forgive me, he began, squeezing through the opening, but I happened to overhear. That is, I heard your conversation. And I must tell you, my father always said one peculiar thing before he died. Most interesting, Miss Marple interrupted. But before you continue, allow me to share another remarkable coincidence. Did you know your families were connected far more closely than anyone ever suspected? Chapter 7. The Family Archives. When the group finally emerged from the underground passage, Miss Marple suggested they all meet at the old Harrington house where the family archives were kept. She knew that if the truth could be revealed anywhere, it would be here. James Harrington led them into a dimly lit room where the walls were lined with ancestral portraits and shelves groaned under the weight of old documents and photographs. My father always said the answer was hidden here, James began, carefully retrieving one of the volumes. But he never shared the details. Miss Marple examined the room carefully. Her gaze settled on a peculiar mark on the wall behind his grandfather's portrait. How remarkable, she said, gently moving the portrait aside. Behind it lay a hidden compartment containing an ancient bundle of papers. Look at this, she continued, unfolding the documents. This is an agreement between your grandfather and Mr. Kent's grandfather. But why would two architects need to sign such an unusual contract? Trevor Kent looked astonished. I've never heard of this. The document mentions joint ownership of some secret security mechanism. Precisely, Miss Marple nodded. And I believe this mechanism is connected to the underground passage. Robert Davis suddenly paled. Then that means someone is currently using that mechanism too. He didn't finish his sentence. A strange clicking sound came from the room, and one of the panels began slowly opening, revealing another hidden compartment. Inside, they found an old journal written in Richard Harrington's hand. It contained detailed records of events from 30 years ago. How fascinating, Miss Marple murmured, flipping through the pages. It appears your father wasn't merely a suspect in that robbery. Then what was he? James interrupted, clearly anxious. Let's read further, Miss Marple suggested. But first, allow me to share another remarkable coincidence. Did you know your grandfather and Mr. Kent's grandfather worked simultaneously on both the White Mansion and this theater? Trevor looked stunned. That would mean they could have created a system connecting both buildings. Exactly, Miss Marple nodded. And I'm certain the solution lies within these records. But before we continue, let me ask you this, Mr. Davis. Why would someone who worked on this case 30 years ago need to revisit it now? Robert nervously fidgeted with his documents. The fact is, my great-grandfather was indeed a policeman, but he also worked with your great-grandfather, Miss Marple. And together they created the security system for that passage. Miss Marple finished for him. I wonder why your great-grandfather needed to conceal that fact. At that moment, Inspector Grayson, who had been keeping watch at the entrance, reported strange power outages in the area. Everyone exchanged uneasy glances. It seems someone wants to prevent us from uncovering the truth, Miss Marple observed, carefully returning the journal to its hiding place. but I'm confident the most important answers lie within these documents. Chapter 8. The Final Threads of the Mystery. Miss Marple carefully examined the entries from Richard Harrington's journal by the light of an oil lamp. An oppressive silence filled the old house, broken only by the rustling of turning pages. "How curious," she murmured, reaching one of the final entries. "Your father, James, describes here a meeting with a man who knew too much about the security system." "Who was this man?" James interrupted, nervously adjusting his tie. "Let's read further," Miss Marple continued. Her eyes settled on a name, Thomas Kent. It appears this was a relative of Mr. Kent's. Trevor looked stunned. "But my Uncle Thomas, he disappeared without a trace 30 years ago." "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "And I believe his disappearance is connected to this affair." Robert Davis suddenly paled. "Then that means someone is currently using Thomas Kent's knowledge too." His words were cut off by an abrupt knock at the window. Everyone turned to see a figure standing in the yard. "Miss Marple!" Inspector Grayson exclaimed, entering the room. "This man, he claims to know the truth about the robbery." "Show him in," Miss Marple said, never taking her eyes from the journal. A moment later, a gray-haired man in an old-fashioned coat entered the room. I must tell you the truth," he began, clearly agitated. "My name is William Brown. I was your great-grandfather's assistant, Miss Marple." "Did you know Mr. Brown?" Miss Marple asked, raising an eyebrow. "That your great-grandfather wasn't merely the theater's watchman, but also had access to its most secure areas?" William paled. "But that's impossible. Only Inner Circle members knew about the underground passage." "Exactly," Miss Marple nodded. "And I'm certain the solution lies within each of our family histories." She studied everyone present carefully. "Did you know, Mr. Kent, that your grandfather and Mr. Davis's grandfather worked simultaneously on both the White Mansion and this theater?" Trevor and Robert exchanged glances. "That would mean they could have created a system connecting both buildings." "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "And I believe the key to solving this lies within these records. But before we continue, let me ask you this, Mr. Brown. Why would someone who worked with my great-grandfather 30 years ago need to revisit this now?" William fidgeted with his papers. "The fact is, I know the whereabouts of the missing jewels." "How interesting," Miss Marple said, retrieving a small box from her handbag. "Did you know this box was found at my home? And it's identical to the one used to store Miss White's jewels." At that moment, a phone rang. It was Miss White's gardener, reporting a strange discovery in the garden. "It seems we're nearing the solution," Miss Marple said, moving toward the door. "But I'm confident the most important answers lie within each of your family histories." Chapter 9. The Unraveling of Entwined Fates. Miss Marple and her companions gathered in the old garden of the White estate, where the gardener had discovered a strange metal object partially protruding from the ground. The sun was already setting, casting warm hues across the landscape. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, carefully examining the discovery. "This mechanism. It's clearly connected to the security system described in Richard Harrington's journal." Inspector Grayson began carefully excavating the spot. After several minutes, he unearthed an ancient key covered in rust. "Remarkable," Miss Marple said, taking the key in her hands. "Now let me tell you an extraordinary story." She looked intently at each person present. "The fact is, 30 years ago, your father, James, and Trevor Kent's uncle Thomas created a unique security system for the underground passage. But they didn't do it without reason." "Why then?" Trevor interrupted nervously, twisting his cap. "Because they knew the truth," Miss Marple continued. "The truth that the real perpetrator of the first robbery was none other than—" She suddenly fell silent, her gaze shifting to Robert Davis. "You've known this all along, haven't you?" Robert paled. "Aye. I must tell you something. My great-grandfather was indeed a policeman, but he also worked with your great-grandfather, Miss Marple, and together they created the security system for this passage. Miss Marple finished for him. But most importantly, they knew the real criminal was someone from their inner circle. At that moment, Inspector Grayson made another discovery. He found an old map hidden within the mechanism. Look at this, Miss Marple said, unfolding the map. It's a plan of the old tunnels. But why would someone need to hide it? Trevor Kent looked utterly stunned. Then this means my Uncle Thomas was forced into hiding after learning the truth, Miss Marple concluded. And I'm certain the key to solving this lies within these records. She studied everyone present carefully. Did you know, Mr. Kent, that your grandfather and Mr. Davis's grandfather worked simultaneously on both the White Mansion and this theater? And interestingly enough, they created a system controlling access through the underground passage. But that means, James Harrington began, clearly astonished, that the real culprit has been right before our eyes all along, Miss Marple finished. And I'm confident the most important answers lie within each of your family histories. Chapter 10. The Final Revelation. Miss Marple carefully examined the old map Inspector Grayson had discovered. In the fading sunset light, she noticed barely visible markings on its reverse side. How curious, she murmured, retrieving a magnifying glass from her handbag. These marks, they clearly indicate the hiding place of the missing jewels. The gathered company watched her actions with bated breath. Robert Davis appeared particularly agitated. You've known about this all along, haven't you? Miss Marple asked him gently. Robert paled. I must confess something. When I worked on this case 30 years ago, my great-grandfather left me one crucial detail. He said the real culprit was someone from our inner circle. And who might that be? Trevor Kent interrupted nervously, twisting his cap. Let's investigate further, Miss Marple suggested. She studied the map carefully and pointed to a spot near the old gazebo in the garden. Here, if I'm not mistaken, lies the entrance to an additional tunnel, she said. And I'm quite certain we'll find answers to all our questions there. The group proceeded to the indicated location. Inspector Grayson carefully cleared the entrance. Within minutes, they uncovered an old wooden door secured with a rusted lock. This appears to be what we've been searching for, Miss Marple said, producing the previously discovered key. It fit the lock perfectly. Beyond the door lay a small hidden chamber containing an ancient chest. James Harrington cautiously opened it, prompting gasps from all present. Inside rested Miss White's missing jewels. But how? Trevor began, but Miss Marple raised her hand for silence. Allow me to explain, she began. 30 years ago, your Uncle Thomas Kent accidentally discovered the truth that the real perpetrator of the first robbery was. She paused, looking intently at each person present. None other than Richard Harrington Sr., James's father. He exploited his connections with the Kent family to create a security system that was actually designed to conceal evidence. James looked utterly stunned. But why would my father? Because he was involved with those organizing much larger operations, Miss Marple continued. The jewels were merely part of a greater scheme. At that moment, Inspector Grayson received word that documents had been found confirming Richard Harrington's involvement with an international smuggling ring. It seems we've uncovered the whole truth, Miss Marple said, carefully closing the chest. And I believe everyone may now find peace. The following morning, Miss Marple received a letter from Miss Eleanor White. Dear Miss Marple, I always knew truth had a way of surfacing. Thank you for restoring justice. So, dear friends, we have come to the denouement of our investigation, where every detail has found its place in the complex pattern of truth. Remember what Miss Marple said, in life, as in the theatre, the true drama is revealed only in the finale.